Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Xinhu Yu, the chair of RMIT Professorial Academy. I'm the host of today's event. First, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we are meeting today. I respectfully acknowledge their elders, past and present. So today we shall hear from distinguished Professor Lee Parker to deliver his lecture on accountability and the office. So this is actually the part of the activities of the Academy to fulfill its obligation and advance the advocate and the thought leader for RMIT. So before we start, we just go through some housekeeping things. So this is actually Teams live event. So you will not be able to ask any questions directly via microphone. However, if you have any questions, please post them to the Q&A. So at the end of lecture, I will pick up those popular ones to ask the presenter on your behalf until the session finishes. So without any delay, please join me to welcome Lee to deliver his lecture. Lee, over to you.
Hello, everybody. I suppose you'd be forgiven for wondering why an accounting professor would be looking at things like the office. Generally, you would expect architecture and design specialists and human relations management and organisation behaviour people to be into this sort of space. But there are a range of issues about accountability and the office which do concern us from a point of view of management control, corporate governance, cost management, efficiency, and indeed OH&S. One of my areas of research of several is in the corporate social responsibility and accountability space, which includes occupational health and safety. And I guess the office has been largely neglected in much of the management and accounting research literature because I suppose for many decades we've been preoccupied with the factory. But if you think about just walking around, for example, the Melbourne CBD, particularly at night, and you look up into the multi-storey buildings, then you see floor after floor after floor of open plan offices. And when you think about the proportion of our economic activity that's really engaged in the service industries, then you could be forgiven for thinking that maybe today's office is the new factory. Now, certainly it's an intrinsic feature of our working life, and a large proportion of the population is regularly physically situated in offices for significant working hours, with a whole lot of routines and rituals that often get involved in that. We can go back to probably the 1850s and onwards to look for early predecessors of the offices that we've become accustomed to. And when you examine particularly, for example, photographic evidence of early office design, you see a trend running from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, where you move from offices that were often configured smaller size in that sort of comfortable salon or club lounge look, many of them, then growing in size and turning into what physically appears to be a virtual production line. And that reflected the office workforce growth that particularly expanded from the beginning of the 20th century. In those first 30 years, we saw huge growth, not just in number of offices and size of offices, but also, of course, a number of clerks and administrators and bookkeepers that were employed. In fact, in the US, for example, between 1904 and 1919, firm or corporate size in itself grew by 30% on average. And between 1900 and 1920 in the US, there was an addition of 3 million new clerical staff into those growing firms. If we jump forward to today, then in fact, professional office and clerical workers constitute the largest occupational group in the workforce in Australia. Around about 4 million people are working in professional, clerical and administrative roles. Now, there's been some research done in terms of the way in which the buildings that housed this growth in office workforce went in terms of what I've called reaching for the sky. And there's really some quite interesting historical research on the genesis of the North American skyscraper, which of course spread into so many cities, and we're quite familiar with, you know, the tall multi-story office building in the CBD today. That initially was, in practical terms, a response to this huge growth in the administrative and office workforce, and it was trying to produce mass office accommodation on small geographic space footprints, but it was also then turned into something that became a symbol of corporate success. And it reflected very much large-scale office interiors. Now, that of course spread out into, for instance, manufacturing sites and other areas. So it wasn't just that the office was high-rise. It was spread out physically at floor level as well. Now, when we get up to the last 10, 20 years, then we see signs of the office starting to relocate and starting to reconfigure. That includes some extent of teleworking from home, and we'll return to that issue in terms of COVID shortly, with, of course, computer technology, the ability to work remotely, and also the spreading of office facilities into regional and suburban hubs. To understand the situation we're in now and the developments that we're seeing moving forward, we really need to go back into history again. So if we look back at the scientific management era, which really commences around 1880 and has its zenith through to about 1920, that was an era when consultants and practitioners and writers tried to reconfigure management as a science. So the big focus was on systematic top-down management for efficiency and producing engineering solutions for making manufacturing and mining work more cost efficiently. And you'll be familiar, even if it's not your area, with the whole notion of Frederick Taylor and his time and motion study work, Henri Fayolle, the French mining engineer in France, the notion of standardized procedures and regularity, top-down orders, following instructions. That became endemic through the manufacturing organizations, but in fact, it was consciously transferred into the office. And that happened with office redesign, office mechanization, and indeed there are scientific management texts that are totally focused around that period on transferring what were thought to be the lessons of scientific efficiency in the factory to become scientific efficiency in the office. Now, this wasn't purely driven by private sector consultants. It was actually driven by government as well. So if we look at the early 1900s, both in the US and the UK, governments became very concerned with public sector inefficiency. And they started to look at scientific management as a way forward through that. And in fact, in North America, this became badged as the progressive era, where the whole notion of efficiency became the focus of both government and business attention. And in fact, it became such a focus that indeed in some North American church pulpits, it was preached as a moral value. So it became quite endemic in social thinking. Now, in recent decades, under what we call new public management, we've seen a resurgence of that sort of thinking. And you don't have to be familiar with new public management to know that if you look at governments around the world, they have very vigorously engaged in downsizing direct service delivery by government, outsourcing that to non-profit and private sector organisations, commercialising and corporatising their operations, very much moving towards government-owned business entities and mimicking the whole private sector efficiency drive, so that both the private sector and the public sector fed into each other in the early part of last century, and really that's still persisting today. So when we look at the history of office design and office efficiency, we actually see a real focus on space and furniture and communications, and even staff physical movement within the office space, all largely focused, when you look behind the impression management, all largely focused on time and cost saving. So when we think back to the office as almost a salon or club-like design, and we move forward to the mass production style of office design, we actually see a movement in the nature of how office work is conceived from being a professionalized administrative craft to becoming an industrial-like task specialization exercise. And there is a real sense within the office, both in the past and today, where the office is a centre of what we call discipline through the record. That's where, whether the office now be diversified and decentralised geographically, or whether it's still sitting in a CBD, it's all about recording, calculating, filing and reporting. Now, if you're thinking this feels a little bit remote, believe me, you can translate this right into your own university and its physical setup and its working setup. So these things carry far and wide, and indeed I'm engaged in historical work on the office, contemporary research work, and projects that run through to universities as well. The name of the game in discipline through the record is to render all staff's actions to be calculable, and if you can calculate what they're doing and what they're producing, then it becomes governable. And so the office becomes a centre where you can attempt to control both the internal organisational world and the external organisational world, where the record is an exercise in both social control and formal accountability. But I'll explain what that means a little more in a moment. I'm going to jump forward now to what we call today's innovative office designs. And one of the most commonly known now, that's been around for about 30 years, is the activity-based working office, or the ABW. The ABW office has been heavily adopted in Australia. It was initiated by a Dutch consulting company in the 1990s. And essentially, it's like the open plan hot desking tradition. And there's a couple of photographs there. There are many, many ways in which the office presents itself. Effectively, if I simplify it for you, if you're a staff member in an ABW office, you get a locker in which you can put your personal belongings. And after that, everything else is shared space. There are cafes, lounges, one-to-one meeting pods, stand-up desks, small group meeting areas. It is entirely open plan. You pick where you're going to go and stand or sit, with or without whom you're going to meet, to do whatever you're going to do, which means as a staff member, you might relocate several times in one day. But all of the space, all of the equipment, everything is shared. Now, there's a rhetoric and there's a reality about this. If I shopping list for you what the consultants and the corporate adopters claim about innovative office designs like this, they argue that it's trying to provide today's people with individual working freedom and flexibility. You can work how you want, where you want, with whom you want, in whatever situation. It is also claimed to enhance staff collaboration because people can move around, people can work with each other, people work individually, they can break into a meeting, break out of a meeting. And therefore it's claimed that this provides a much more encouraging, comfortable environment that improves staff satisfaction, that improves staff sense of well-being, and it allows people to focus better on their task at hand, whether it's a small group discussing something or whether it's an individual working in a quiet area. And it's also argued to appeal to the younger technology-oriented generation, where you walk around with your electronic tablet and your mobile phone, and that's it. It's the fulfillment of the dream of the paperless office. And the paperless office was something that was advocated and promoted 30 years ago, but in many organisations has never really reached reality. Now, what do we know from the research that we've done that sits behind these claims? Well, what we know, and we know it from even published declarations by corporates on their websites, that in general, the adopters are targeting a 30% reduction in their floor space and associated cost reductions. So reduced energy costs, cleaning costs, storage space costs, insurance costs, lease costs. But it's about a third that they're hunting for. They are also looking to reduce their churn costs. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, I probably could explain it in a university sense. If you had a department with a particular profile where you had, say, 5 professors and 3 associate professors and 15 lecturing staff, and if the 5 professors got 20 square metres each and the associate professors got 15 and the other staff got 10 square metres each, there's your sort of space profile. And if you were setting up divisions or spaces or whatever, you'd configure the internal structure of the office that way. But what happens if that profile changes and all of a sudden you get less professors, more associate professors, more lecturers? You actually face a whole lot of restructuring costs if you're going to adhere to those sort of space rules for different levels of the hierarchy. Now, in fact, this new type of office design eliminates that issue, because there is no space structure that's connected to hierarchical levels, so that if you get a change in the hierarchical profile of your office staff, it has no impact. There are no additional restructuring costs. So that's what that's really about. Also, it is found both in stated objectives and in what actually gets achieved that there's a floor space occupancy densification that goes on. So not only is floor space reduced for your existing number of staff, but then it is found that gradually furnishing and people are shifted more into the reduced space. So it is argued that over time, it's possible to increase the number of staff on a particular floor space by approximately 20%. To give you an example, publicly, the Macquarie Bank in Sydney has declared that it has saved already in doing this $10 million per annum in lease costs. And that's just the lease costs, not some of the other costs that I've referred to. So there's a new focus. I mean, it's another form of social engineering in terms of trying to socially engineer staff attitudes and behaviours and outputs. And the focus is very much on output. In some ways, the staff are still very much under surveillance because you're very observable wherever you are in this sort of office design. But in the end of the day, there tends to be a greater emphasis on measuring what your output is, regardless of where you were, how you shifted around the floors, and whether your supervisors could see you or not. Now, ABW as a modern office, and it's really it's another form of the open plan office, has a real management control agenda. I mean, the underlying agendas are reducing both fixed overhead and operating costs. That's been the case both historically with the production line open floor office of the, say, 1930s, 1940s and onwards, and today's redesigned office. It is less overtly stated as a sort of a front stage performance agenda, but it is quite surprising how often organisations on their publicly available websites state the fixed overhead and operational cost reduction as, if you like, a backstage agenda. And I'm referring to a theorist called Kaufman, who wrote in the 50s on front stage and backstage performances. Also, it's looking for efficiency and productivity increases at the same time. So it's trying to pull off getting reduced costs, reduced floor space, denser occupation of the floor space by staff, but then getting more output out of them. But there is one further agenda, and that's because it's designed in a very observable, welcoming, comfortable, well-being emphasis way. It's also to do with managing client and customer relations, where there's an interface between the client and customer and the office itself. There is evidence starting to show up in some organisations where they find that the functional work needs to retreat back into a more traditional, backstage, hidden functional design. We see that in relation, for example, in professional accounting firms to taxation work. Is this stuff new? Well, to some degree it is, but very largely, while it looks different, its agendas and what it's trying to achieve reflects those historical scientific management agendas. Cost and efficiency control are very, very serious agendas, despite the impression management that organisations often put forward, both to their staff and to the customers. So it's very much a marketing customer relations strategy, but the scientifically planned notion behind it does remain. I and a colleague are doing some research at the moment on the big four global accounting firms, looking at what they have revealed about their office designs and agendas, both in Australia and globally. And they publicly pronounce that they are designing to try and enhance collaboration. That's staff to staff collaboration and client to staff collaboration. And they're looking for productivity. And when they talk about productivity, they're talking about speed of task completion, revenue generated, and faster problem solving. And again, they're using different workspaces for different tasks, as I've explained before, and they're looking for networking and efficiency improvements. And again, that's not just networking between the inside and the outside of the organisation. It's talking about networking with staff groups, between senior staff and junior staff, and of course between staff and clients. So there is a real focus nonetheless, particularly in the language that's used and the promotional language that's emphasised, where they're really focused on the client and appealing to the client. So they actually talk about labels like the client experience, or they talk about labels like client collaboration. And they're quite open in terms of the agenda is to get the client feeling like they're involved. They're involved in the deliberations. They're involved in the decision making. But that is also occurring between how they get different groups within the firm to relate to each other. In terms of floor space reduction and densification in the big four global firms, we do have publicly declared data. For instance, Ernst & Young in some of their offices have decreased floor space by 25%, and they've increased staff numbers on that floor space by 50%. Or if we look at the big firm KPMG, there are examples they've given where they've decreased floor space by 35% and that they've removed what they call dead zones. So they've gone looking for areas that have low occupancy and they've removed those completely from their formal usage. How does this compare to the present and past? And you might find, I know it's only small for you looking at it on the screen, but that photo is around about the 1920s. And of course, I have a larger, sharper version of it. You really cannot count the number of rows all the way to the back of the picture. It just goes on and on and on. Those people, notice it's a gender mix. Often the office of the 20s and 30s is portrayed as growing through the typing pool, and that was an element, but there was actually quite a gender mix in the growth of the office, and those people are actually working on comptometers or adding machines, but it's a large group of people. Certainly, there was some similarity between today's efforts at client impression management and the efforts of yesteryear, where an office was visible to clients, making the client feel valued and esteemed, trying to reduce the barriers between the client and the firm, building client goodwill. Yeah, there were similarities. In terms of staff mobility, visibility and surveillance, as I've said, in terms of surveillance, the surveillance is really more on the staff's output because the staff within the ABW office are highly mobile. Nonetheless, there was a great focus on trying to govern where staff moved and how they moved in the past and today. Now, today might look more flexible, but of course, with COVID and COVID-induced redesigned protocols, that may represent a return to a stricter control over how and where and when people physically move through office spaces that was certainly evident in the past. The retention of functional staff areas that we see some evidence of in some floors of organisations today represents a reversal more towards the traditions of the early to mid-1900s. But certainly space cost minimisation and usage efficiency maximisation was a major agenda in the past. It is a major agenda today. Nothing's really changed despite any change in discourse or impression management discourse. And essentially what the game is implanting a commercial logic and a client focus into staff attitudes. Now, what about the pandemic era that we're sitting in now? Of course, we need to remind ourselves that our current pandemic has quite a trajectory, and you can see that on the slide in front of you. Some of them may have been more global than others, but it's not new. And as we're told by public health officials, what we're going through now will happen again in some other form. Now, what I can tell you is that when you look at latest property research, central business district office space demand in the Australian capital cities is falling, and it is actually projected by independent researchers to fall through to 2021 and 22. Now, one has to be careful about this because property councils and some organisations are currently putting a very brave face on this, but the independent research shows that vacant space is increasing dramatically and will continue to go that way in 21, 22, and that we are staring down the barrel of permanent longer term changes. And there are some figures for central business districts as high as anticipated 60% vacant floor space across the CBD. And we know from a lot of publicity about this that this comes from the lockdown periods, the home working periods, and then the discovery by both individuals and organisations that quite a healthy degree of productivity and efficiency can be retained even though staff are diversified out of the physical office through the transitions we're doing to teleworking, but also we're facing transitions to office redesign and office protocol re-engineering. These are significant issues, and I can give you examples right from in the Melbourne CBD, where there are some corporates with, say, a multi-storey tower block that have run exercises looking on how long would it take to get staff into the office in a COVID-safe way, given that they've got to come in through main entrance doors and go up through the lifts, and how long to get them out. Some of the estimates for some of them are as high as 3 hours to safely get them in and 3 hours to safely get them out, which is clearly not workable. So that increasingly firms are surveying staff, making longer term arrangements for hybrid operations where staff work at home totally or part of the week, or moving to hubs in regional areas. All of this stuff has major social responsibility and occupational health and safety impacts. And it's really an example where, in terms of reporting on this, it's not just a matter of reporting what an organisation has spent on office redesign or redesigning protocols, for example, because what you've spent may not turn out to be effective. But it's going to become highly evident through a concept I call accountability through action, where you can actually see the visible corporate responses. It becomes physically evident to staff, it becomes physically evident to customers and clients, both in terms of where the staff are, who's in the building, what the building looks like, how the furnishings have been repositioned, all of that sort of thing. The problem we have right now is that the open plan office and the activity-based working office is incompatible in terms of infection control, because it largely involves completely shared spaces. Hot desking, shared spaces, shared furnishings, shared equipment, they are major virus spreaders. So this gets looked at from an investment versus cost control perspective. Now, I'm not covering all the human relations, organisation behaviour aspects. There's a lot of aspects to these sort of issues. But if we look at it from, for instance, capital investments, if one is going to reconfigure large-scale offices to become safe from an occupational health and safety point of view, then for infection control, one needs reduced floor occupancy levels, you need assembly area, corridor and lift area control systems, you need redesigned and spaced out furnishings, and there are now arguments that over the last 30 years, the amount of space per individual has been slowly coming down and down and down, and now it's going to have to go back up to, for instance, 1980s, 1990s average levels. There are also a whole range of technology infection controls that are available, and I've listed some of them there, and the protocols, as you can see, can involve split shifts, staggered start times, staggered break times, more frequent cleaning routines, protocols for sanitising, training and communication programs for staff. So there are a whole lot of capital investments that are necessary to render the offices that we see today to be effectively COVID safe. And yet that's being required in an era where we have economic downturn, we have organisations struggling for financial viability, and yet they need to make these upfront investments. If we look at pre-COVID and during COVID now, there is a suggestion that organisations may attempt to cling to their previous office cost control agendas. That is low cost, high density, flexible layout. There is a sense in which when employees are allowed to spread out to, for instance, suburban or regional hubs, work from home either wholly or in a percentage wise, that then there's a transfer of organisational cost to the teleworking or hybrid working employees. And that's an issue that's going to, I think, raise a whole lot of questions in terms of who bears that cost. Certainly, even in, for instance, London in the UK, we're seeing the spread of organisations getting out of CBD buildings and beginning to set up hubs even in regions up in the Midlands and allowing staff to work anywhere, for instance, in England or Scotland, and then just move to the hubs periodically when they need to. So the whole question becomes, are we looking at a question of public health versus financial self-interest? And we certainly seem to be. So we face a changing office world where there's a growing tension potentially between corporate cost and staff occupational health and safety and staff welfare. And this reflects, if you like, a continuity of the historical agendas we've seen in the organisational so-called scientific management of officers and their staff for efficiency and cost control. Regardless of how it physically looks, it is, if you like, the new factory in a different guise. There are some really interesting research questions that are growing. For example, to what extent does the open plan office reflect the open plan restaurant kitchen, where the chefs cook amongst the diners and the diners pay a premium to sit near the chefs to watch them at work? To what extent are we looking at something akin to pre-industrial revolution, where the office starts re-emerging as a cottage industry that spread right through regional small group areas down to the individual home? I would suggest from the research we have to date that we are looking at office design, office management, and the role of the office in organisations today. It's a classic competitive playing field. It's money versus people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lee, for a very interesting talk. I have actually a question. The thing you are talking about perhaps has assumption there, which is sort of hasn't been explored, is the culture, right? In different culture, then certainly how people interact are different. For example, in Asia, this kind of hierarchy, social, kind of ranks is sometimes appears to be more valued than in other countries. So do you think that is there any study show that how culture impact on this the office, the way how people sees the office and how they should be arranged?
Thanks. That's a really important question, and certainly in my research I've not gone there yet, and I think it's a really good point, because even when we look at, for instance, the work that accountants do, the diversification of the work the accounting profession does in, for instance, North America, Australasia, UK, Europe, is not so much reflected, at least in attitudes, in, for instance, the Asian region, where there are much more traditional views about the role of who does what and how it gets done. It's a much more compliance, financially oriented sort of role. So I think you make a strong point there. Of course, this is where, in terms of the office, we really need multidisciplinary research teams to look at this, because it's a small group really internationally, but we really need HR and organisation behaviour people to take a closer look at this. Of course, my focus has been very much on accountability, efficiency, productivity, but even from the HR perspective, I see some evidence where, for example, even in a Western setting, where, for instance, junior staff may find themselves interacting more closely and sitting for periods next to senior colleagues in the hierarchy, and they don't feel comfortable about it. So, I mean, I think there's several layers of culture we need to look at in this. There is the sort of ethnic culture, there's the national culture, but there's also the organisational culture. And some organisations, as we know, have a much more hierarchical culture, even if they're sitting, say, in a Western setting. So I think you raise a very important point, and I think that's just a further addition to the research agenda on this. I mean, I would emphasise that when we look at, if you like, the world of the office, it's a relatively small cohort of research that we really have, even across the disciplines.
But how do you see the future? You touch on a few, the potential future kind of the trend. So what do you see we probably after the COVID-19, we won't go back to where we used to be. So what are the scenarios do you think that this is going to be very, very interesting? Because I was touched on by your point about this civilians, this kind of a monitoring performance, because in older time your performance is basically measured by the time they bought from you, paid for you, rather than actually the productivity. But I guess in the future the productivity outcome may become more important than the actual time it's taken.
Yeah, that's it's a good point, Xing, because if we look back to the early period of scientific management in the 1880 to 1920 period, of course, that's when the scientific management consultants really pioneered the whole notion of the piece rate of payment on production, and so in the future world. And of course, I'm no better at predicting it than anybody else. But of course, as if you like, the working community have become so much more accustomed to communicating and presenting in the way we're doing right now, and meeting in the way we're doing it right now, it means that people are much more flexible in terms of where they go and how they do things and how they meet. So I suppose the question becomes, there's very strong evidence that both in the design of work and the design of workplaces and the way in which people are managed, scientific management never went away. It's always been there. Now, it can resurface in various ways. So, for example, if it's possible to measure what people produce as output, then in the post-COVID world, we might see a reversion to more people being paid by output. And of course, we've seen that. I mean, if we look at the public sector in Australia and we look at government-owned business entities, I mean, a good example would be Telstra, where Telstra over many years has had its workforce pruned down and down and down. So the people working on the lines got sent out of the organisation, but then they got taught how to create themselves as a small business and then got rehired back in as contractors. So we see loads of examples in Australia where organisations have shared staff, and then staff have been put into small businesses and then contracted back in and then paid not on time, but on what they produced. Now, I think another interesting question about all this is, to what extent will we see change? I mean, that's a very uncertain thing. You know, we hear stories this morning about this vaccine that looks promising with a 90% protection rate, maybe. If vaccine sort of solves our problem in the next 12 months, then one might argue that a lot of organisations and people in society will relax, will try to move more quickly back to the good old days as what were, and we will see maybe less preparation for trying to prevent the next crisis. If the period of having to be careful lasts longer, then we may see some of these trends we're seeing at the moment in terms of social distancing, hybrid working, redesigning offices, then that may become a more permanent feature. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to predict, but it certainly appears to be that organisations have been discovering, even in the last 6 months, that sometimes the productivity of their staff has actually increased with them being off-site, and that it is potentially that we're going to see managers who may have not been in favour of teleworking now seeing that as an organisational advantage, regardless of whether there's a COVID threat or not. So it's a very difficult thing to predict, but certainly in terms of, for example, office design, at the moment, in terms of COVID prevention, what's being envisaged is reduced densification of, for instance, desk areas, going backwards to assigning a particular working space to a particular person and them not being there all week.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just trying to look at, it seems to be there is no sort of further any questions posed. So for that, I think we can stop here. So thank you very much, Lee, for a very interesting talk, and all the best. Okay. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.